In Numbers chapter 14, verse 24, Numbers 14, verse 24, the Scriptures tell us that Caleb wholly followed the Lord. It says, "My servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it." There's a lot in that verse that I'd like to focus on for just a moment. We are familiar with the story of Joshua, Caleb, and the other 10 spies, that as God has brought His people out of Egypt by the hand of Moses, and now they're right there on the edge of the promised land, and God says, "Send in these 12 spies." They send out the 12 spies, and whenever they come back after 40 days in the promised land, they come back, and Joshua and Caleb bring this report that the land is a land flowing with milk and honey, but that there are also powerful cities, fortified cities in the land, and there are even giants in the land. But while Joshua and Caleb's report contained both encouraging and maybe somewhat discouraging information, being fortified cities and the like, that did not dissuade these two from saying, "With God we can do this. With God we can accomplish this." We know that the other 10 spies brought back a different report. They brought back they brought back the same report, but they persuaded the people that it was impossible to do it because of the giants in the land. They described themselves as grasshoppers in the sight of these people. I think that's where they failed. They saw it was in the way that they saw themselves. Sebastian, how do you see yourself? Think about this for a moment. Everyone, how do you see yourself as a Christian? Because the way that we perceive ourselves is going to have an effect on, an impact on what kind of work we're able to do, what kind of impact we are going to have on the world. If I think I'm a grasshopper, you know what kind of impact I'm going to have on the world? Grasshopper's impact. That's what kind of impact I'm going to have on the world. And that's the way they looked at themselves. But with God, what did Paul say in Romans chapter 8? If God is for us, who can be against us? It's a rhetorical question. The answer is no one. The answer is no one. No one can even occupy the place of against us. That's how lopsided the odds are, how lopsided the battle is. That there is no battle. That God is with us. Think about the armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6, 10 through 18. That God has provided for us this spiritual armor with which He says we can face the attacks, the fiery darts of the devil, and not be harmed. But that's not the way they saw themselves. They saw themselves as grasshoppers, and as a result of seeing themselves in this light, they were neglecting the power of God. They were not seeing how God had delivered them all of these different times in Egypt. By saying, we can't do this, we question the power of God. And that's precisely what they did. They convinced everyone else too. Instead of believing the 2, they believed the 10. And because they believed the 10, Israel was condemned by God those 20 years and older, to walk around in the wilderness for the next 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies were in the promised land. But the 2 spies that said, we can do this, Joshua and Caleb, were the only 2 that were allowed to go in. As a matter of fact, we've been studying in the book of Joshua. Joshua was the one that's leading them, right? He's leading them, and we see all of the tasks that even Caleb is entrusted with. And later on in his life, he's 85 years old, and he's still fighting for the Lord. That's something we're going to talk about next Sunday, unless I do like I did this morning and study the wrong outline that I had prepared. Anyway, so Joshua is leading the people. Caleb, 85 years old, and he asks to go to war, to go to battle, and to take this land. And if God is with him, then he would be able, if God wanted him to have this land, he could take it. And so Joshua and Caleb are these only 2 men. But I want us to focus just for a moment this afternoon on what it means to be wholly dedicated to the Lord. Because if we took this phrase today and just kind of looked at it, if we asked this question, what does it mean to be wholly dedicated? Well, wholly means completely, right? And then we might get the misguided idea that in order to be wholly dedicated, I can't mess up. And that's wholly wrong. Wholly dedicated does not mean I can't mess up. You know how I know that? Because all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. That includes Caleb, who is described as wholly dedicated to the Lord. So if Caleb can be wholly dedicated to the Lord, you and I can as well. What does it mean to be wholly dedicated to the Lord? It means that we follow Jesus all the days of our lives. That's where we begin. Such was the case with Caleb. He followed the Lord in the wilderness. He follows the Lord walking around in the wilderness for those 40 years. He follows the Lord in the land of Canaan. And 45 years later, Joshua chapter 14. Yet many do not follow the Lord all of the days of their lives. We get maybe close to the end of our lives, and well, look at Lot's wife. What did she do? She turned back. Look at the Galatians. So soon after they had obeyed the gospel, Paul has to write a letter to them, Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 9, and he says, how is it that you're so soon bewitched to another gospel, which is not another gospel? There have been many throughout time, though, that have not followed the Lord completely. But what about us? What about you? Do you follow Jesus in your youth? As Paul instructed Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 4, at verse 12, he says, let no one despise your youth. And I think as we look at what Paul tells Timothy here, as I get older, I have less patience for those that are younger and their lack of understanding. And I forget sometimes that it took me a really long time to get to know these things and experience these things. And so what I'm trying to say is, while Paul tells Timothy, let no one despise your youth, those of us who are older need to be careful not to despise their youth. He says, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. But we need to be prepared not only to follow God in our youth, but to follow Him in our old age. I won't spend a lot of time here because that's what I plan to talk about next Sunday afternoon, is our ability to follow God even in our old age. So, will we follow Jesus like Caleb followed the Lord, wholly dedicated to Him. Another way we can see wholly dedicated, wholly following the Lord is in our hearts. So not just our actions, but following God, wholly dedicated to God with our hearts. Caleb followed Him wholeheartedly. And, you know, the greatest commandment given, Christ was asked that question, wasn't He? What's the greatest commandment? What was His answer? His answer was, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, right? And love your neighbor as yourself. This was it. This love from the heart. But sadly, many try to serve the Lord with a divided heart. Jesus warned us that we can't do that. We can't serve God and mammon, God and the world, God and materialism. And Solomon found this out very quick. 1 Kings chapter 11. He was influenced by all of his foreign wives to sin. James warns us, James chapter 4, verse 4 as well. So what will we do with Jesus today? Shall we follow Him with all of our heart? He said, if you love me, do what? What did He say? If you love me, obey my commandments. That's where it's at. We express our love, we express our desire to be wholly dedicated to God by our what's in our hearts and our actions. And even following Jesus, even when it's hazardous, whenever it's difficult, whenever we know, what did Paul say? Those who will follow the Lord, those who will be faithful to the Lord, will experience difficult times, persecution. Caleb followed the Lord despite all of the dangers. Think about it, Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. He said there's giants in the land. How much more hazardous to your health can it be? These people are living in fortified cities. And look at the way that the rest of Israel is describing themselves. What could a giant do to a grasshopper? But step on him. It's hazardous. He was willing to face even the wrath of his brethren by speaking up and standing with the Lord. He was willing to take a mountain from a giant in his old age. In Joshua chapter 14, we just studied this at verse 10 and following. It says, "And now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive," Joshua speaking here, "just as He said these 45 years, since the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I am this day 85 years old. I am still strong today as in the day Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength then for war and for going and coming. So now give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me and shall drive them out just as the Lord said." He's willing to face these difficult times, to face these hazardous times. And many people will serve the Lord as long as it's convenient, as long as it doesn't require a chance on my health, a chance on my livelihood. But that wasn't the case with Joshua or Caleb. When it's safe, remember, Peter had no problem following the Lord until the Lord was arrested. And he's on trial. And that was when it was a little hazardous to be a follower of Jesus. And not once, not twice, but 3 times Peter denies the Lord because it was hazardous to his health. But what about us? Will we follow Jesus today, even if it's not convenient, even if it might mean that we will be ridiculed or persecuted or face dangers? will we follow Jesus like Caleb followed the Lord, despite it being hazardous? Certainly, the commitment of Caleb described here in the Scriptures is one that we should imitate. But how are we enabled to follow God fully? I think we need, how am I going to accomplish this? I need to first keep my eye on the Lord. Because when my eye is distracted, when I'm looking at something else, when my focus isn't on the kingdom first, I'm going to have struggles. But also by having this different spirit. Look at what the text said there. In the very beginning we read Numbers chapter 14, verse 24. Numbers 14, verse 24. Look how it describes. I know everybody's tired. I'm tired too. Look how he's described here. It says, but my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit. Well, what sort of spirit did Caleb have? Well, it's different in comparison to those other 10 men who came back, those other 10 spies. What was their spirit? Their spirit was pessimism. Their spirit was cowardice. Their spirit was not recognizing the power of God, trust in God. So what was Caleb? He was optimistic about the work. He understood that with God he could accomplish this. He trusted the Lord. And so he knew where to keep his eyes. And so we need to have this sort of spirit, and we can be strengthened by this type of spirit, recognizing that we can accomplish these things, these tasks, these commandments that God has set before us. And how much more so when we recognize that the Spirit of God is with us. Romans chapter 8, verses 12 through 13 says, so then, brothers, we who are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if you live by the Spirit, you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16 as well. So let's finish with this. Some motivation. Some motivation. Why should I take the time to imitate Caleb? Why should I have this desire to be wholly dedicated to the Lord? That's the question we're always asking, right? Well, what's in it for me? Well, there's a lot in it for you. Beginning with this lifestyle, this different spirit, this motivation. It's going to lead us into a useful life. Friend, if that's not part of your prayer right now, it needs to be. God, use me. Now, before you pray that, you should be ready. You should be ready. Because it's going to happen. If you mean it, it's going to happen. There are going to be opportunities, because they are everywhere, to speak for the Lord, to teach for the Lord, to let your light shine. Consider how God was able to use Caleb. He's one of their leaders. He's a servant of God who spied out the land. He's an example of courage and faith. He's a reminder of God's justice, just looking at his life and how God brought him into the promised land. Him and Joshua alone were the only two of that age to be able to occupy that land. An inspiration of service, even in his old age. So how useful will you be in your youth? And how useful will you be to the Lord? In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 20 through 22, Paul wrote to Timothy, he says, now in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. Some are honorable, some are for dishonorable. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work. So flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. There's that preparation I was talking about. To be useful to the Lord, flee those things. Prepare yourself. And the Lord will be able to use you like He used Caleb. And don't we want to be useful for the Lord? The last thing we want to hear from the Lord is what? I'm disappointed, right? I'm disappointed in you. We want to be useful for the kingdom and the saving of souls. And then finally it leads us to not only useful service, but a fulfilled life. One of the things that people often find and regret after reaching retirement age is having neglected the things that they really wanted to do most of their life until now when they're older. They don't feel like they've had that useful life, that life fulfilled. Here, Caleb, 85 years old, and he's ready to keep on working for the Lord. Consider how he was fulfilled. God gave him this land. And not just him, but this inheritance around the land of the city of Hebron is for his family as well. So he was working not just for himself, but for others. And this land was a land of rest from the war. What kind of fulfilled life does Jesus offer for you and for me today? Well, the Scriptures teach us, Ephesians chapter 3, verse 19, it is a life of love toward us that passes knowledge. And to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. God's love for you is beyond what man can comprehend. The peace that God desires for you is beyond what man can comprehend. Philippians chapter 4, verse 7. Peter says the joy that God has in store for you is inexpressible. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 8. You see, and all the things that we spend all of our time worrying about. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. And all of these things that we spend all the time worrying about, God will provide. Don't we want to live this fulfilled life? If we do, let's let this example of Caleb lead us to be wholly dedicated to the Lord and allow Him to give us this useful life, that's this fulfilled life. Don't forget, Caleb and Joshua were the only two out of 603,550 men to enter into the promised land. That's a lot of people, and a very small percentage who entered, who survived those 40 years of wandering out around in the wilderness, and they were only able to do it because they had been wholly dedicated to God. So how are we following the Lord? Are we following the Lord like Caleb, or like those who died in the wilderness? If we're following God like Caleb, then maybe we've already begun that walk with the Lord. We've obeyed the gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, in that we have put sin to death through repentance, and we've been buried with Christ in baptism, raised to walk in newness of life, Romans 6, 3 and 4. But if you haven't begun this dedication to God, this walk with God like this, that Christ commands of us, we encourage you to do that. But what about what if I have been following the Lord like the 603,548? If you have a need, come now while we stand, sing this song.